There's a study I came across that I still think about all the time. A professor from Harvard University surveyed more than 5,000 Americans and asked them a simple question. How do you think wealth is distributed in the United States? He divided the country into 5 equal groups. The top 20%, the bottom 20%, and the middle 20% groups. Then he asked people to estimate how the nation's wealth is split among those 5 groups. After that, he asked a second question. What would the ideal distribution look like? Here's what stood out. 92% of respondents, more than 9 out of 10 people, said the wealth should be distributed more evenly than they believe it currently is. That alone says something very powerful. Most Americans already suspect the system is tilted. But what's even more surprising is how far off our perception is from reality. If you compare 3 things, what people think exists, what they think would be ideal, and what actually exists, the gap is enormous. The ideal distribution is just as far from reality as reality is from what we imagine. Let's set aside the ideal for a moment. Here's what most Americans think the distribution looks like. Not perfect, a little skewed toward the top. The bottom 20% is struggling. The middle class is squeezed and the rich are doing quite well. But now here's the actual distribution. It's dramatically more unequal than people believe. The bottom 40%, nearly half the country, owns almost nothing. On a chart they're barely visible. Meanwhile, the top 1% owns more wealth than most Americans think the entire top 20% should own. That's hard to grasp, so let's simplify it. Instead of 350 million people, imagine just 100 Americans standing in a line. Teachers, coaches, firefighters, electricians, construction workers, doctors, lawyers, investment bankers, maybe even a content creator or a YouTuber. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. On the left are the least wealthy and on the right are the wealthiest. Now imagine the total wealth of the United States, about 170 trillion in 2025, as one giant pile of cash that we're going to distribute among those 100 people. First, picture perfect equality. Everyone gets the same amount. That's pure socialism. Most people agree that wouldn't work. We want incentives, ambition, and the possibility of upward mobility. So here's the distribution most Americans said would be ideal. A smooth curve. The wealthiest are maybe 10 to 20 times richer than the poorest. But even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line stays almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. There's inequality, but it feels fair. Interestingly, Democrats and Republicans largely agreed on this shape. 92% said this would be ideal. Now let's look at what people think America looks like today. It's more unequal than the ideal. The bottom groups are struggling more and the middle class is also worse off. The wealthiest earn about 100 times what the poorest earn and about 10 times what the middle class earns. Not great, but still somewhat balanced. Except that's not reality. Here's reality. The poorest Americans barely register. About 15% are below the poverty line. And the middle class isn't much better. Even households in the 80th to 90th percentile look modest compared to what's above them. Only the top 10% are better off, and then the top 2 to 5% shoot completely off the chart. And the top 1%, his wealth tower doesn't even fit on the same scale. Here's a stack of cash restacked all by itself. That single percent owns about 40% of all the nation's wealth. Meanwhile, the bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people or 80 out of those 100 people, share just 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. Today, the richest 1% take home nearly a quarter of all national income. Back in 1976, it was only about 9%. Their share has almost tripled in the last 50 years. And that's just the difference in income. The difference in wealth and asset ownership is even bigger. The top 1% owns roughly half of all stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50%, just half of 1%. That means most Americans aren't building wealth through investments. They're surviving paycheck to paycheck. Of course, many wealthy individuals work hard, but is a CEO really working 380 times harder than the average employee in their company? Not the lowest paid worker, not the janitor, the average one. The typical worker would need to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in a single hour. This isn't an argument for absolute equality like socialism. It's not about eliminating incentives or ambition, and it doesn't require achieving the perfect or ideal distribution most people described. It simply requires recognizing that the country we think we live in economically is not the one that actually exists. The first step isn't radical change, it's awareness. Because you can't fix a system you don't understand. Share this before it gets ignored.